Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm so sorry for the delayed start. We can blame it on hustings, but like the good old days, we'll go deep into the night. The motion before the House this evening is this House prefers Gladstone to Disraeli, two of the great prime ministers of the 19th century, but figures, as hopefully we'll discover in the proceedings, who still have a real salient contemporary relevance. You all know the score. It's what's the penultimate week? What's that? Week 7? Something like that. So you all know how the rules work. But just to remind you that as members, it's your right to intervene, and you can stand up at any time during any speech and interrupt by saying, on that point of information, or will you give way? There are 5 parliamentarians and an excellent biographer of Disraeli speaking this evening. And they are very welcome, but this is a membership society, and I do hope the members get involved as we go through. Without any further ado, I will introduce you to the first speaker on proposition this evening, Lord Adonis. Lord Adonis is a Labour peer who served in the Blair and Brown cabinets. He currently serves as the chairman of the European movement and has written numerous books, including a recent biography of Ernest Bevan. Lord Adonis, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, Gladstone was president of the Oxford Union. Disraeli didn't go to university, and I know that to many people in Cambridge it's infinitely preferable to have somebody who's uneducated to somebody educated at Oxford. So I do realise that I'm on a losing wicket to start with, and that alone may be a reason why you opt for Disraeli this evening. But I can't see any other particularly compelling reason why, in the long course of history, which I invite you to consider, one would think that Disraeli a greater leader than Gladstone. Gladstone was right on all the principal issues of his day as he reached his mature judgment and framed the whole debate, not just for his century, but for the next century, on the great liberal causes of human rights, independent and democratic government, a non-corrupt state, and the whole future of Ireland. And Disraeli played catch-up on all of those issues. But none of that is to denigrate Disraeli, and indeed the whole context in which they work. This debating chamber, these products of the great Victorian cult of Parliament, which took place after the 1830s, the exemplars were Gladstone and Disraeli. And when you look at what's happened to European history, let alone global history over the last 2 centuries, we should prize in this country and treasure a tradition which puts at the first and foremost debates and parliamentary engagement, of which the 2 titans in history have been Gladstone and Disraeli, and not all those other means of advancing and resolving conflicts which, alas, are so common in our world. And so I hold them both in enormously high esteem, and particularly in some ways Disraeli, because though Gladstone was a very great liberal and I think was right on the big issues, which is the reason why you should vote for him, Disraeli created a culture of conservatism which was hugely important for the whole development of this country, which was an acceptance that progress could not be turned back, that reactionary politics had its limits, which was a very unconventional view amongst conservative and aristocratic elites in 19th century Britain, and that progress should be made by peaceful and parliamentary means. He wasn't a Democrat, but he believed in parliamentary means. Gladstone was much more of the Democrat, his belief in the people. But so, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what conclusion you reach at the end of this debate. Both of them have a lot to be said for them. But by and large, in my experience, as Roy Jenkins once said to me, by and large, he said to me, Andrew, in life, it's better to be right than to be wrong. And on the big issues of the day, Gladstone was right, Disraeli was wrong. And on that sort of, you may think, slightly trivial grounds, I invite you to support him. However, if I'm getting into debating mode, because apparently we're supposed to be doing debating things, well, debaters are supposed to use tricks like quoting arguments against people, and having done research, you get researchers to look at quotes which are incriminating from them in the past. And I want to let you know, ladies and gentlemen, I have been doing my research. I have here all the quotes from my immensely distinguished and they are enormously interesting. We have the biographer of Disraeli, we have a senior member of the House of Lords, we have a former Attorney General. Never has there been such galaxy of talent ranged against people seeking to advance an argument as we have here. As Disraeli famously said of the Gladstone government, behold a range of exhausted volcanoes. However, it is a great mistake in life to write things down. because they do get quoted against you. And Ed Young, who's an enormously distinguished biographer of conservative figures, has made a great mistake, ladies and gentlemen. He has written a biography of Disraeli. He wrote it with a former president of this society, Douglas Hurd, an enormously distinguished former foreign secretary. However, on this essential issue I put before you of being right rather than being wrong, Ed Young himself proclaims Disraeli to have been wrong and Gladstone to have been mostly right. Let me read you the key incriminating quotes, which I look forward to his explanation as to how he's going to duck and weave and try and pretend that he didn't say them and they were juvenilia and in his mature years he wouldn't have said them. This is what Ed had to say about his great subject, Disraeli. He says, Boris Johnson should have been ruined years ago. We're going to come back to Boris Johnson in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, because Disraeli is the Boris Johnson of the 19th century by Ed's own admission. Boris, like Disraeli, is entertaining. And he has done what Disraeli did in the 19th century, raised the level of interest in politics up several pegs. I entirely agree with that. That's true, but that isn't the same as being right. However, the damning bit is in his final conclusion. If we look, he says, of Disraeli, if we look in his career for solid achievement, we shall be disappointed. Disraeli may not have transformed the nature of British society. He may not have transformed our standing overseas. Note the two negatives in a row. But he made politics interesting and engaging. Well, that is the Boris Johnson, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Boris Johnson of the 19th century. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's be clear. It doesn't matter that he was wrong. It doesn't matter that he was a charlatan. It doesn't matter that he was totally cynical. It doesn't matter that he was largely amoral. He was entertaining and he was fun. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had enough of that in this country over the last 10 years, and don't ascribe it to history too. Let's save history from it. Now, please.
You may be right about the many comparative points between Disraeli and Boris Johnson, but I'm wondering if you agree that Boris has one greater sin, and that is being president of the Union of the other place.
The other art of debating is you harness all arguments to your cause, even if they're bad. So I'm going to say that's a brilliant argument. I cannot think of a better argument than that you should not want somebody who's been president of the other place. Now, I do concede that Disraeli was a better novelist than Boris. Disraeli, Sybil is a great conservative novel and it has some good phrases in it. Disraeli was very good at good phrases, the two nations and all that. Boris's novel was called The 72 Virgins. I think we can guess what Mr. Gladstone would have made of that one. He wouldn't have wanted. He would have been saving all 72 of them in rapid succession. So they have a lot in common. But the point about it is that neither of them are serious. Boris isn't serious, indeed hugely damaging to the politics of this country, but hugely entertaining. And the same is, I regret, true of Disraeli. And I want, if I may, because I've now the other art of speaking in this place, is that there comes a point when you have to be serious. It can be late in the speech. Sometimes if the bell rings, you only get to it in the last 10 or 15 seconds. But I want now to develop a serious point, which is on the big issues of the day, which are of huge consequence. The future of our representative system and whether we should move towards a democracy. The future of our system of government, whether it should be non-corrupt. The nature of international human rights, whether they are valuable and should be championed. Do you mind if I just develop the point a bit further and then I'll come through? You don't accept interventions, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, in the middle of your key serious points. You leave it till afterwards. And the future of Ireland, where Gladstone was in favour of a policy of conciliation, of supporting the Irish people and ultimately giving them self-government, which, if it had happened in 1886, would probably have avoided a century of bloodshed and terror. On all of these issues, Gladstone was right and Disraeli was wrong. And I say to you again, ladies and gentlemen, it is better to support the people who are right, particularly when they are establishing precedents which are important to the whole future of the country, than the people who are wrong. And in this great crisis that we face at the moment on Ukraine, maybe the greatest existential crisis of European civilization, and Gladstone was a great believer in European civilization. I have no doubt which side Gladstone would have been on. He would have been on the side of the Ukrainian people, on their inalienable right to self-government and to freedom, on the absolute imperative for us to stand up against fascism and terror. I'm not sure which side Disraeli would have been on. He would have taken a great power judgment on it. I'm not sure, but I am absolutely certain what side Gladstone would have been on. And he would have said of the Ukraine, and he would have said of the Russian. So I'm just concluding. All my time is almost over. He would have said of Putin and the Russian government, and it's monstrous, vile, historically destructive behaviour. He would have said of them what he said of the Turks when they rampaged and murdered and massacred across Bulgaria in the 1870s. He would have said of them, as he did, he would have said of the Ukrainians, as he said of the Turks, and I read his great words, which mobilized the whole nation and won him an enormous election victory to reverse the cynical foreign policy of Disraeli's government. He said, let the Turks, he said, now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely by carrying off themselves. Their Zaptiars and their Mudirs, their Bimbashes and their Ubashes, their Kamazans and their Pashas, one and all bag and baggage shall, I hope, clear out of the province that they have desolated and profaned. And as we, at the moment, with great and sombre hearts, see the desolation and profanity being caused by Russia in another European country, the Ukraine, I think now is the moment to rally to the cause of the greatest proponent of European civilization in the 19th century, William Ewart Gladstone. I beg to move.
Thank you, Lord Adonis. You have thrown down the gauntlet. Picking up will be Ed Young. Ed is a biography of Disraeli, which he wrote in cooperation with Douglas Hurd, and it was published by Orion in 2013. It was longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize. The book became a Sunday Times bestseller and was widely praised by critics. Ed, you have the ears of the house.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, I should say at the start, you said, in fact, you've made a great observation. There are 6 speakers tonight. 5 of them are excellent parliamentarians. I am the 6th. I am an unelected politician. I tried and failed to be elected in 2017. And I think it's worth pointing out that I was a student here like you were, and I never spoke at the union. I wrote speeches for a future and indeed a prime minister, and I was never invited to the union. I did Gladstonian work for one of Britain's biggest food businesses and was never invited to the union. I have no other credentials to my name apart from this book about Disraeli. And the fact that I have been invited here tonight tells you everything you need to know about the motion. The motion is, does this House prefer Disraeli or Gladstone? It is not, is this man right or this man wrong? The motion is, who would we rather spend our time with? And that can only be Benjamin Disraeli. Now, and don't take my word for it. We're here, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about 2 great men. I think we should start with a word about a great woman. And that great woman is my mother. My mother, like Disraeli, didn't go to university. She didn't come from a privileged background. She went to a convent school in Scarborough. And in 1960, when she was 8 years old, she was asked 2 questions along with her class. Would you have been a Roundhead or a Cavalier? And would you have supported Gladstone or Disraeli? And she says, she turns 70 next month. She says with great pride, I'd have been a Cavalier who voted for Disraeli. And she is not alone. She is not alone. The point of this debate is, who do we prefer? And after Disraeli's death, not just a few hundred, not just a few thousand, but millions of people across Britain made very clear that they preferred Disraeli. There is a league. Give me a moment and I'll hand over to you. Just hold your nerve. And that league, the Primrose League, had 2 million members. 88 quotations by Disraeli are in the Dictionary of Quotations. Many of them are still quoted. All of them are still true. As he said, to be a great lawyer, you do give up your chance of being a great man. England does not love coalitions, and a Conservative government is an organised hypocrisy. Discuss. I will take my intervention now.
You keep saying that this motion is one about preference.
It is.
Well, I, for one, prefer being right than wrong.
And that is right. But I think, just going back to Lord Adonis's point, he made the point repeatedly that you should never write anything down, but you should read before you come into a debate. And the word preference does take you down a certain path. Let me just finish this point for a second. What Disraeli gave to politics and into the country as a whole was an inspiration. And if you look at politics in the whole, that is what it's all about. It's about bringing people into it. Gladstone did not bring people into it. There is a case against Disraeli. I wrote most of it, and all of it is true. He's a terrible prime minister. He did not do great things for this country. He fell asleep in cabinet. All of these things are true. But he made politics interesting and exciting, including for people with no vote. Gladstone did not do that. The letters that Disraeli got were unique in the time, and they are still remembered today. That is the true legacy of Disraeli. You've got a front runner, and that is why we should remember him. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you say that Disraeli encouraged people to be interested in politics even if they had no vote, but Gladstone was involved in giving them that vote.
Well, Gladstone was involved, as we were going to hear a little bit later, Gladstone was involved in a lot worse than that. What I would say is that the motion, if we take it on its merits, is about them as individuals. And we didn't hear much, actually, about Disraeli or about Gladstone from my noble lord a minute ago. We heard a lot about Boris, but we didn't hear much about Gladstone or about Disraeli. And if you do, like me, a bit of research, and you go to Gladstone's library in Hawarden, those of you doing finals, you go up to Chester, spend a week there, and you will see Gladstone's own books. Hang on. Though you'll see Gladstone's own books. And in one of the books, you will find a note that was written by a great biographer in Gladstone's lifetime, and it describes all the great things about Gladstone. The loftiness of his principles, the piety of his behavior, the sanctity of his morals endears him to the national consciousness. Now, I think most of us in this room, if we were to read a paragraph like that about ourselves, would feel rather pleased with ourselves and would remember it. Gladstone read that paragraph, felt rather pleased with himself, and put an enormous tick in the margin so anyone else who read that book would know that he approved. That tells you everything you need to know about this man. He was a reforming politician. He did many great things, but he was a prig. And that is the real motion we're here to talk about. And I would leave you, Mr. President, with two very important points. The reason to vote for Disraeli is personal. It's not political. He was witty in a time when pomposity was treated as a virtue. He was tolerant in an age where intolerance was normal. And most important of all, he gave imagination to politics. And the two crucial factors that should endear him to everyone in this room are courage and imagination. And we wrote this book, still available in all good bookshops, 10 years ago, and we were encouraged to do it by Lord Weidenfeld, who was our publisher. Lord Weidenfeld started the speech he gave when he told us to write this book, very old man, 92 at the time, by saying, I want you to write this life of Disraeli, because when I fled the Nazis in 1938 after Anschluss, and I arrived at Charing Cross, the consul who marked my passport said, you'll be safe here because we had a great Jewish prime minister once. That is what Disraeli achieved. He did it against all the odds. He had people throwing abuse at him throughout his career. He stood for Shrewsbury. A man arrived on a donkey saying he'd come to take him back to Jerusalem. Disraeli soared past all of that. That is why he deserves our praise. Gladstone did none of that. He was the permanent insider in politics. Disraeli was the outsider, and he found his way. And he did it because of the second point, which he made speeches that people actually listened to. The letters he got, the things that people said to him were from ordinary people with no vote. Harcourt, a great liberal, spent time writing letters to him saying, you have enlarged the possibilities of the future. He got one from a man in Manchester saying, I never read any speech of yours without thinking that it'll be remembered in 100 years' time. Oscar Wilde said, Disraeli does not deserve a place in Parnassus, but he will be quoted in Piccadilly. And that is what exactly has happened. And don't take my word for it. I started tonight by talking about one great woman. I'm going to talk at the end about one other. And Queen Victoria is the best judge of this. And Queen Victoria used to say, when I have dinner and I'm next to Mr. Gladstone, I always end up thinking that he is the cleverest man in England. And when I have dinner and I have Mr. Disraeli next to me, I think I am the cleverest woman in England. That is a gift. That is important. And that is what politics should be about. Bringing people in, engaging with people, and inspiring people. If the motion was this is a great prime minister, you may have had a case. This is about what does the House prefer, and I say we prefer Benjamin Disraeli. Thank you very much for being here.
Good one. Thank you very much, Ed, and what a fantastic start to this debate. I'm going to turn to the audience and ask them whether or not there's a case to be made in proposition for the motion this evening. I'm just checking around. I'm going to go to a president ex officio. Name and former college, please, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's not just my former college, it's my present college. I'm at Trinity, and although you leave this university, they can't chuck you out of that. In my contention tonight, it's that a brilliant speech was made by the author over there, but I've actually read his book. And in it, he points out, as he briefly mentioned, but it was silenced by your applause, that Disraeli fell asleep in the cabinet meetings about social reform. We're talking about a country divided profoundly by poverty, profoundly by social inequality. The two nations he talks about. And the two nations, he cares so much that he falls asleep when thinking about the other one. And yes, he'd be more fun to have a pint with. And yes, he's probably got the quicker line. But is this a country which actually thinks our problem has been over the last 20 years, we have been too serious about politics? Is this a country which has struggled profoundly against the sensibilities and the pomposity of members of parliament? Or is this a country that has suffered by the fact that most of our politicians care more about their quick line in the tabloids than they do about the substance of policy? And if you think that this country has been led down the long road, not just by the modern Disraeli Boris Johnson, but by the modern Disraeli Nigel Farage, by the modern Disraeli Nadine Dorries, by people who will find any line for the newspapers to give them more coverage, then no matter how much of a prick, no matter how boring, no matter how sanctimonious, if you want to restore some decency, some moral centre to our politics, I urge you to vote with the proposition tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I feel impelled to say that Ed's book is available in all good bookstores. I feel impelled because he said he'd write a terrible review about the Union if I didn't. Would anyone like to make a case in opposition this evening?
Roshan, Wolston College. So we've heard some very unkind things about Disraeli this evening from surprisingly both sides of the House. But I think I'm going to take after Disraeli and his comments about laying on compliments and getting on with Queen Victoria. And he said the secret to that was laying on praise with a trowel. I'm not sure what that says about Queen Victoria. Least of all what it would say about Disraeli. But if we look at Disraeli, if we actually look at the substance, there's lots of grandiose talking about morals this evening. Who has the moral centre? Who seemed like they were the greatest moral force of their time, comparisons to Boris Johnson. But if you look at what they did in government, Disraeli was way ahead of his time as a Conservative Prime Minister. He passed reforms for housing, sanitation, employment, work-related acts, crime and conspiracy-related acts, all sorts of different things that made people's lives better. Cleared the slums as well. All the terraced houses you see in London and other cities, you'll often see their brick mark of the year they were made were either around the time or during the time Disraeli was Prime Minister, because it was the legislation he passed that allowed the working classes and the middle classes to live in homes such as this. And when you look at Mr. Gladstone, well, let me just give you a sort of a story. If any of you are here from London, in Bow, in East London, there's a statue of Gladstone. And every few months, his hands are painted red by the local residents because the owner of the factory that used to be there, that built the statue, wanted to commemorate Gladstone, not because he was a great moral force, because he helped solve the issues of his time, but because not only did he make unions legal, but he also made membership of unions legal, but he made it illegal to strike. So in terms of progress, in terms of social reform, Gladstone may have talked a lot, but he would have delivered little for the average person, and that's why I think you should vote for opposition. And I would just like to end with this popular quote from the time, which should guide your vote, which was a rhyme by the people of London, which was, for Disraeli, I mean, for he was a jolly good fellow, no matter what the Liberals think, because he shortened the hours of work and lengthened the hours of drink. What more could you want in a Prime Minister?
I've seen at least one Russell fan and one Palmerston fan this evening, so I'm hoping there's going to be a case made in abstention.
Hello, I'm Sam, I'm at Trinity. Now, I found myself nodding in agreement with both sides of the House. Gladstone was right on virtually every issue. He was also incredibly boring. I would hate to spend any time with him. Disraeli, by and large, was wrong on every issue. But clearly it was a lot of fun, and I'd much rather get a pint with Disraeli than Gladstone. But this whole debate, I think, is premised on a flawed dichotomy embodied by the figures of Gladstone and Disraeli. That suggests that it's impossible to be simultaneously right and fun. And as an example of someone who was simultaneously right and fun, I would look to the decades immediately prior the ascendancy of Gladstone and Disraeli. I'd look to Lord Palmerston. Now, Palmerston was much admired by both Gladstone and Disraeli. Disraeli, of course, sought very hard to join forces with him. He never had much interest in this because, of course, he knew that that Disraeli was wrong. But the point I'd make about Palmerston is that, like Disraeli, he had a way with words. Like Disraeli, he was a very flamboyant, protean character. Like Disraeli, he enjoyed life more than Gladstone. He enjoyed getting drunk. He was sleeping with prostitutes well into his 80s. And like Gladstone, he was right on the central issues. He and Gladstone abolished the paper duties in 1861. He, like Gladstone, pursued an interventionist foreign policy. Now, the first speaker for the opposition mentioned that when Jews came to Britain in the 30s, they were told, well, you'll be safe here. We made one of you prime minister. He could just as easily have said, you'll be safe here because one of our prime ministers looked at a Jew, the victim of an anti-Semitic attack in Greece, David Pacifico, and extended, as he said, the strong arm of England to his defence. In short, if you're a boring person, you can walk through the eyes. If you're an interesting person, you can walk through the nays. But if you are both interesting and correct about the central political questions, I would urge you to follow Palmerston by walking through the centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the second proposition speaker this evening, Baroness Smith. Baroness Smith of Newnham is a Liberal Democrat peer and a professor at the Department of Politics here in Cambridge. She's a passionate advocate of the UK's continued involvement in the European Union. Baroness Smith, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I probably come to this evening with a bit of a disadvantage. I studied at the other place. But I didn't hack the union. So at least, like Ed, I didn't spend my time as a student at the debating chamber very much. One of my contemporaries was Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I believe was here very recently. He did spend a lot of his time on his hind legs. But I was the boring, swotty student. I spent most of my time hiding, reading my books, including on British political history. So I did read about Gladstone. But I don't think that being somebody that reads is necessarily a bad thing. We've actually already heard from Ed that it's incredibly important to read, ideally to write books, but he'd like us to read them. And one of the reasons that I would say that we should prefer Gladstone is his passion for education, for the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, but also his commitment to reading, to scholarship, but also to expounding education, not just for the privileged, but for those in his own area as well.
Point of information. You say Gladstone wanted to extend education to the non-privileged. Was he trying to do that when he wanted to prevent non-Anglicans from entering Oxford?
He got you there.
What I was going to say was actually about people in the local area. So his library at Harden was to be open. It's the only prime ministerial library in the country. It is open. And in particular, there is still support for clergy people to go and study there, but so can anybody else. So if you're interested in politics, in religion, in international relations, the Harden Library, Gladstone's library, is a place still to visit. It's a beautiful part of the world, but it's open to the people of North Wales. But why Gladstone? What do we mean by preferring? Because we've heard from my colleague, Lord Adonis, that Gladstone was on the right side of history. And we've heard from Ed Young that Disraeli was the person you wanted to have a drink with. He was much more fun. But what do we mean by preferring? Is it that we like somebody, or is it that we think somebody's got really important characteristics? Characteristics of leadership, the ability to speak, to hold an audience. Now, I got my phone out just before to put a timer on. Unfortunately, I forgot to turn it on. So I will remind people that I haven't spoken for 6.5 minutes already. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Gladstone, in his first budget, spoke for 4.75 hours. Now, people have suggested that you wouldn't want to have a drink with him. But in fact, he had the drink with him when he gave his budget and said, I got by with egg and wine. Now, I'm not quite sure that I'd want to mix egg and wine, but anyway, it worked for him. But he went round the country speaking. He was a great orator. So this idea that he was boring, that he was a prig, that he didn't speak to ordinary people, he did. He spoke in Scotland, he spoke in the south of England, he spoke in the north of England. He commanded huge audiences at a time when we didn't have social media. And those speeches were recorded in newspapers and people read them. So this is somebody who was able to connect with the people. The Daily Telegraph referred to him as the People's William. So the idea that somehow he was remote is a mistake. So powerful were his speeches that the author, the sociologist Weber, talked about charismatic leadership, and his prime example was William Gladstone. So the idea that somehow we should prefer Disraeli because he was more fun to go to the pub with is a mistake. And by the way, the Harden Library, or the Gladstone Library, has the family pub next door, the Glyn Arms. So don't be taken aback. Gladstone did have interests, but he was also somebody who was an internationalist. Yes, he studied Latin and Greek at school and at university, but he also studied modern languages. He was able to converse in many languages and was committed to the concert of Europe. He was committed to human rights, and he was committed to humanitarian actions. He didn't believe in going to war if we didn't have to.
Was he committed to human rights when he ordered the shelling of Alexandria in 1852 on payment of debt?
Point taken. There is a point when Dennis Healy's law of holes needs to be listened to. When in a hole, stop digging. And so I'm not going to take that on. But what I am going to say is how committed he was to working with other European countries, including with France, trying to ensure that we work together, very much in the way, I'm not taking any more interventions at this stage, that working with France was the right thing to do, then as now. But also, he was willing to look to what was happening in the Balkans. He is still seen in Bulgaria and in Armenia as somebody that stood up for the rights of those people. That, I think, is vitally important. And at a time, as Lord Adonis said, when we're looking at what is going on in Ukraine, then I would want a Gladstone to be leading this country and looking for ways to send Russia home. So does shelling necessarily mean you don't believe in humanitarian law or international law? Not necessarily. You can be involved militarily even if you believe in human rights and the rule of law. But beyond the international, there was the economic. And nobody so far has talked about the economic side of Gladstone. But he actually had some good ideas as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And of course, Gladstone is someone who moved unusually from right to left. He was what Margaret Thatcher might have thought of as being rather economically dry as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wanted to get rid of debt. Well, people now might say, well, that's something dreadful that the coalition government did, that George Osborne sought to do. Why do we want austerity? Well, you might want to get rid of debt from war in order that future generations are not immiserated. And that was something Gladstone was trying to do, to get rid of debt. So I think economically, he is very much a leader we should prefer, but also somebody that was willing to change his mind. And that is also hugely important. To have views and never change your mind isn't the sign of a good leader, and it isn't necessarily the sign of somebody you'd want to spend an evening with. Gladstone acknowledged when he'd made mistakes. He changed his mind, as I believe my friend Lord Alton is going to talk about later, over slavery. And he was actually somebody who, over the course of his life, kept thinking and refining his ideas, who was able to lead and was somebody who could be respected. Would you want a leader who couldn't be respected? Would you want somebody who was actually able to stand up and persuade the people, but not just persuade the people who didn't have votes, but actually to look for ways of empowering those people and extend the franchise? As a woman, the only platform speaker who's female, then I can say that I'd have liked Gladstone to have gone much further on enfranchisement, but at least he was looking to extend the franchise in a way that other leaders didn't necessarily. So I think of his time, Gladstone was to be preferred to Disraeli in terms of leadership, in terms of oratory, in terms of his commitment to democracy, and in terms of his commitment to those in the Balkans. I preferred Gladstone to Disraeli, and I hope you do too.
Baroness Smith, thank you. The second speaker in opposition this evening is Lord Parkinson. Lord Parkinson is a Conservative peer and a former special advisor to Theresa May. He currently serves as a Minister for Arts in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And inexplicably, on this order paper, we failed to mention that he was also a president of this place once upon a time. Lord Parkinson, you have the ears of the House.
President, though this side of the House is the side of Disraeli, I want to begin by talking about Gladstone. Not the politician, William Gladstone, nor the merchant and baronet, Sir John. I want to talk about Jack Gladstone. Jack Gladstone was tall and debonair. We're told he was 6'2". He worked as a cooper, a maker of barrels, but not by choice. For Jack Gladstone was an enslaved Guyanese man, one of hundreds, many more hundreds, working on the inaptly named Success Plantation in what was then called Demerara, is now Guyana. Jack Gladstone led the Demerara Rebellion of 1823, one of the largest uprisings of enslaved people in the history of the British Empire. Though those rebels, those who uprose, fought bravely, they were unsuccessful. Hundreds were executed as ringleaders, including Jack's father, Kamina. And deported to St. Lucia. Jack's surname was Gladstone because he was owned by Sir John Gladstone, the father of the man who hovers over the speakers on the proposition front bench tonight. He was one of 2,508 people owned over 9 plantations. When slavery was abolished, Sir John Gladstone received £106,769 in compensation from the state. The noble lady Baroness Smith has just talked to you about the elimination of debt. That is a debt which was finally paid off in the early years of this century. The money that Sir John Gladstone got was the largest amount of any single slave owner. It's the equivalent of some £80 million in modern terms. So when you hear about the achievements of William Gladstone tonight, have that figure in your mind, because that is the money which enabled those achievements. That is the only success, if we can call it that came from the Success Plantation.
On that point, is it justifiable to judge somebody by the sins of their fathers?
And I make no apology for beginning my speech in slavery, because that is where William Gladstone began his political career. His maiden speech in the House of Commons was a defence of his father. It was a complaint about a reference which had been made in the House of Lords. He brandished 2 letters from his father's estate manager, which, I quote from the Hansard, May 1833. These letters which spoke in the content, healthiness, their good conduct, and the infrequency of some severe punishment.
Point of information.
No, this wasn't just filial loyalty. I'm still responding to the previous point. This wasn't just filial loyalty. This wasn't just youthful folly. In the 1850s, 20 years after that maiden speech, Gladstone was still arguing that the best way to end the slave trade was by persuasion, not force. He was opposing the use of anti-slavery patrols by the Royal Navy along the coast of Africa. He was critical of the anti-abolitionist movement in the United States. I look forward to the speech of the noble Lord Roshan, who is a commendable campaigner against modern slavery today. A very brave, a very wise speaker in Parliament. We're lucky to have him. But I'd like to hear why he thinks that the Gladstone, not just of 1833, but the Gladstone of the 1850s, was a man untarnished by the sins of his father. And this is a telling contrast between the 2 men we're debating tonight. We've heard, and we will hear more, of Disraeli's achievements in his long political career. But perhaps the most impressive achievement was that he climbed the top of the greasy pole of the tour. We know it, the greasy pole, because it was a phrase of his. Gladstone was elected to Newark at the age of 22, a seat in the gift of the Duke of Newcastle, whose son had obviously been at Eton and at Oxford with Gladstone. Incidentally, as has been mentioned by Lord Adonis, William Gladstone was president of the Oxford Union, and I mentioned that tonight because I understand, Mr. President, that we are merely the cool-down act after the main event of this evening, the husking. You and I may not object to the fact that William Gladstone was a president of another place, but he was most certainly a union hack. Disraeli, by contrast, did not go to university. He did not go to university because Jews could not take their degree when he was of that age. And I mention another name, Alfred Louis, who, to the great commendation of this society, became president of the Cambridge Union in 1850, 6 years before this university allowed people of the Jewish faith to take their degree. Nor could Jews be elected to Parliament, so it's just as well that Disraeli converted, though he always referred to his faith in Celtic terms as the blank page between the Old and the New Testaments. Where Gladstone was handed a seat, it took Disraeli 5 attempts to be elected to the House of Commons. He faced appalling anti-Semitism. My old friend, Mr. Young, has told you about a man who turned up in Shrewsbury with a donkey to take him back to Jerusalem. Let me tell you about the Irish MP, Daniel O'Connell, who said in Disraeli's early runs for Parliament, he has just the qualities of the impenitent thief on the cross. There were also slurs on homosexuality because of his friendship with Edward Bulwer Lytton, a former treasurer of this society. So it's perhaps unsurprising, given his status as an outsider, the first outsider to break through into the upper echelons of British politics, that Disraeli dedicated himself to the emancipation of other groups of people. As he put it in a famous speech of 1872, to the elevation of the condition of the people. Among his achievements in government was the Second Reform Act. This Reform Act was passed while he led a minority government. And let me tell you, having been a special advisor, political secretary to a Conservative Prime Minister in a minority government, it is not easy to get things done. The noble Lord Adonis told us that Gladstone was right on the big issues of the day. He did not legislate, he did not succeed in the things that he pursued. He did not get his Irish rule plans through Parliament, even when he had a majority. By contrast, Disraeli passed the 1867 Reform Act. It gave the 1867 Reform Act, in which I look forward to hearing from the ex-president in a moment, gave the vote to working men in urban constituencies. It doubled the size of the electorate. So I was astonished to hear the earlier intervention and the speech of the noble Baroness, trying to dragoon Gladstone into the cause of enfranchisement. It was Disraeli's Second Reform Act which did this, was it not?
It was indeed, and Disraeli's Second Reform Act did this because he knew that if he didn't, that Gladstone would beat him in the polls. So Gladstone shifted the political centre of those years to force a reprobate like Disraeli to do into a progressive.
But it was Disraeli who did it. It was Disraeli who achieved this Act of Parliament. It was Disraeli who doubled the size of the electorate, resisting the wrecking amendments from William Gladstone during the passage of it. He passed also social reforms in his later time in a majority government. The Artisans' Dwelling Act, as we've heard, his tribute, his legacy is seen in the bricks and mortar. The Public Health Act, the Chimney Sweepers Act. So hard did he work, as we heard from the ex-president, he sometimes fell asleep from his exertion. The names of the debate tonight are, as the noble Lord Adonis said, two titanic names. I'm sure, Mr. President, you discounted when drawing up the motion for tonight the proposition that we might debate Ted Heath versus Harold Wilson, or Gordon Brown versus David Cameron. Both of these men, of course, deserve to be remembered today and will be for many more. But Disraeli's name is the famous one. Gladstone's deserves to live in infamy. It is still a common name in the Caribbean. It is a common name because it was once brandished into the skin of the people his family owned. When that name was removed from student halls in Liverpool City, which the noble Lord Alton represented in the House of Commons, neither of the people intending to leave the party, the noble Baroness Smith, was willing to defend the idea that it should remain there. The Liberal Party is embarrassed of William Gladstone. Conservatives and many more of all political persuasions are proud to stand in the Disraeli tradition. He's the only Prime Minister to inspire a posthumous cult. I wear the badge of the Primrose League, which was set up in his memory, which brought 2 million people into politics in It brought men and women into politics on equal terms for the first time. People of all persuasions are proud to call themselves one nation Tories because it is a mark of compassion, of moderation, of social conscience. And I end with the words of my late noble friend Lord Blake, the great biographer of Disraeli. He pointed out that Disraeli is a timeless figure. It is hard to imagine the great Gladstone living in any other period, where it is quite easy to imagine Disraeli living today. There is a champagne-like sparkle to him, which is scarcely ever been equalled and never surpassed. So, Mr. President, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, pour yourself a glass of champagne and join us on this side of the House in a toast to the life and legacy of Benjamin Disraeli.
Thank you, Lord Parkinson, for those excellent remarks. Would anyone like to make a case from the floor in proposition this evening? Any brave souls who'd like to make a case for William Gladstone?
Oscar Despard, Christ's College. Now, I haven't prepared any remarks tonight, but I would like, as an Irish citizen being here today, to pay tribute to the role that Gladstone played in promoting Home Rule in Ireland during the late part of the 19th century. It was he who had the imagination, along with Charles Stewart Parnell, for the Union of Hearts, which was a movement that was designed to promote Home Rule in Ireland in a way that would be conciliationist, in a way that would bring together both halves of the community, or indeed both the North and the South. In the same way that Disraeli wrote about reconciling two nations, it was Gladstone who made an effort to bring that to pass in the Irish nation. And it's a great pity that he was blocked by conservative movements, largely in the House of Lords at the time, from achieving that aim. And while admittedly it has been said with some justice that Gladstone devoted the final years of his life to reconciling himself to solving the Irish question, but whenever he was getting warm, the Irish secretly changed the question. It's also important to recognise that he got very close to solving a thorny issue that still bedevils British politics today. And for that, I think we have to pay tribute to the far-sightedness of a visionary, liberal, tolerant politician. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that excellent intervention. Would anyone like to make a case in opposition this evening?
Michael Watts, Queens. Now, despite my sort of hyacinth bouquet, Margot Ledbetter accent, which is probably not a reference anyone here will get, I do not come from a privileged background. Neither of my parents speak like this. I've sort of put this on. Now, if you look, go onto Wikipedia, that most authoritative of sources, and you look at a list of all our prime ministers, you will see that every single one before Disraeli either has a lord, earl, duke attached, or or in the case of few like George Canning, who, by the way, was only prime minister for 119 days, were sponsored by members of the aristocracy. They often ended up going to private school, which is not what Disraeli ended up going to. So as someone who went to a state school and, perfectly ordinary state school, someone who's not from a privileged background, Disraeli, the man who broke the mould of our prime ministers, and I'd like to say I admire any prime minister, regardless of what party they're from, if they have come up not through private education, if they've come up not through privilege. For me, Disraeli is better than Gladstone because he broke the mould and he rose not through a private education, not through privilege, but I believe through his own virtues. And that is why I urge you all to vote no today. Let me just check the motion, make sure I'm right. And to give a thumbs up to Disraeli and, for anyone not from a privileged background and who went to a state school.
And finally, would anyone like to make a case in abstention? I'm going to look around to see if there's any female hands. And if I'm missing any, please point out. I will go with the first hand, in which case which was just there. Name and college, please.
Sam Hudson, Trinity Hall. So a lot's been said tonight about who's been on the right side of history. Now, I don't think Gladstone or Disraeli were entirely on the right side of history throughout their respective prime ministerships. One politician who stood consistently on the right side of history was Keir Hardie, when he founded the Labour Representation Group in 1900, which led to the foundation of the Labour Party, which has given us the NHS and has been the most transformative force in British society. The party that Gladstone stood for died, rather unfortunately, or not so unfortunately, depending on what position you want to take. Disraeli's Conservatives they're Conservatives. They haven't done much for society, and you see the state we're in right now. Much of that's down to Conservatives. Also, back to talking about the right side of history. Keir Hardie supported women's suffrage. Same can't be said for either Gladstone or Disraeli. If you want to stand on the right side of history, support Keir Hardie and go through the central doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for that very creative method of making an abstention speech. I'm going to hand over to the final two paper speakers to take us home this evening. On the proposition is Lord Alton. Baron Alton of Liverpool is a former Liberal Party and later Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament who has sat as a crossbench member of the House of Lords since 1997 when he was made a life peer. Lord Alton, you have the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I should declare an interest in that I didn't go to either Oxford or Cambridge, and in fact was the first in my own family on the question of privilege to come through and have a higher education. But I did have a son who studied here at Peterhouse, and I have to say a daughter who studied at Pembroke College, but the other place. So having declared my interests, let me deal with Sam's point before I start. Don't abstain. That's the worst position to possibly be in. Don't walk through the middle doors. People who stand in the middle of the roads anyway get run over. It would be far better for you to choose one side or the other. Very happily. No. Well, it's a very good thing to check your facts before you make a point of order. And I'm not a Lib Dem, I'm an independent. I sit as a crossbencher. I left the Liberal Democrats because I felt it had walked away from the traditions of Mr. Gladstone on a question of conscience. So that is why I was the Liberal Chief Whip in my day, and I was a Young Liberal and President of the National League of Young Liberals because of Gladstone, which is one of the reasons why I accepted the invitation to come this evening. But Mr. President, two things have been on my mind today as I was preparing to come here. One was as I walked through Westminster Hall, the walls of which, if they could speak, and I'm sure Stephen and Andrew and Dominic and Julie and Ed would all agree, but if the walls could speak, they'd tell you everything you need to know about the history of this country. The two greatest of our prime ministers are commemorated in that hall. There are plaques both to Mr. Gladstone and to Winston Churchill. There isn't one to Benjamin Disraeli. So if you're looking for a contemporary view of what people thought of these prime ministers, not that one was insignificant, I'm not going to argue that, but who was the really true great statesman, I would say it was William Ewart Gladstone. But there's been another president on my mind, Mr. President, this week, because we had the honour, all of us who are privileged to serve in that place, to be able to hear Vladimir Zelensky on Tuesday as he addressed both houses of Parliament. And I felt, as I heard him speak, as Baroness Smith has said to you this evening, that he represented so many of the things that Gladstone himself stood for: the sovereignty of nations, the collective duty to denounce aggressors and to defend democracy. All those things resonate with the life of William Ewart Gladstone. What's brought me here tonight isn't just that the People's William, as Baroness Smith rightly described him, was born in Liverpool, a city I had the privilege to represent, as you heard from Stephen, in the House of Commons. Not just that he was elected to lead 4 administrations as our Prime Minister, not just the domestic legislation, which included not just the secret ballot, but the Education Act of 1870 as well, which set us on the road to the other education reforms that would be enacted in due course. Not just the combination of his faith and politics that led to the most extraordinary exchanges in the Times between him and John Henry Newman, learned exchanges. Not just his self-declared mission to pacify Ireland, which was referred to before, seeking justice and home rule for its people, and being willing to split his own party on that matter of high principle. Not just his passionate opposition to the Opium War, something he shared with Benjamin Disraeli. He called it a moral outrage. Not just his willingness to change his mind, Stephen, and to denounce slavery. Not just his steadfast championing of the human rights and self-determination of the Balkans, because even now his example is an example for all those who care about integrity and truth and public life. That is why I accepted the invitation to come and share with you some words tonight. It was in 1896, at the age of 87, at Hengler's Circus in the Low Hill neighbourhood of Liverpool, where I was elected when I was a student, to a neighbourhood where half the homes had no inside sanitation, running hot water or bathrooms. A legacy in 2 respects from those Victorian days. And yet they were proud houses needing renovation renewal. And I was able to do something about that in due course, inspired by the example of people like Gladstone. But it was there at Hengler's Circus that he made his final public speech. And he told a crowd of 3,000 people, "You may wonder what brings an old man like me out of retirement." The answer, he said, was 2 Armenian gentlemen who had visited him at Hawarden. At Hengler's Circus, having heard their description of abominable massacres, he denounced the great powers for failing to confront the Armenian atrocities, which 19 years later would lead to the genocide of 1.3 million Armenians. He said, collectively, the powers have undergone miserable disgrace, being dragged at the chariot wheel of other powers. He warned that indifference had led to crimes, I quote, which have already come to such a magnitude and to such a depth of atrocity that they constitute the most terrible, most monstrous series of proceedings that have ever been recorded in the dismal and deplorable history of human crime. The failure to heed Gladstone's warnings would lead one day to Adolf Hitler as he planned the final solution, saying with scorn, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" In our odious cancel culture, attempts, of course, are now being made to defenestrate Gladstone because of his father's role in the slave trade, and we heard it again tonight. I'm not asking you to vote for his father. This week, beyond midnight, at 1 a.m. in the morning, Baroness Smith and I were on our feet in the House of Lords, denouncing what the government is currently trying to do through the New Nationality and Borders Bill, to water down, something Stephen would be proud of because of the role he played with Theresa May, her greatest legacy, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. We were there fighting the fight that Gladstone himself would have embraced. A few days after the passage of the abolition bill, referred to by Stephen, Gladstone's friend Henry Wilberforce took Gladstone to the deathbed of his father, William. They prayed together, and 10 days later, he attended the funeral of William Wilberforce at Westminster Abbey. Gladstone wrote this: "It brought me solemn thoughts, particularly about the slaves. This is," he said, "a burdensome question." And just as he later embraced the cause of wider electoral representation, as we've heard, Gladstone then renounced his support of slavery, admitting that Wilberforce had profoundly affected him, of course.
I'm sorry to press the point I made earlier, but it was after that deathbed visit to Wilberforce that he was rejecting the role of the Royal Navy patrolling the coast of Africa to stop the slave trade. It was after that deathbed visit that he was speaking out against the abolitionist movement in the United States. How sincere a convert was William Gladstone?
William Gladstone said, I have been a learner all my life. No, he didn't change his mind on the day after the abolition bill, but he changed his mind in the days that followed. He said this, he said, I can see plainly enough the sad defects, the real illiberalism of my opinion on that subject. He denounced the owning of slaves as, these are his words, the foulest crime. And abolition is one of the 10 great achievements of the previous 60 years, saying that the masses had been right and the ruling classes had been wrong. People should change their minds when they get it wrong. A man who never made a mistake never made anything. And why should someone, as the interjection put it well, I thought earlier on, be held to account for mistakes made by their father, or indeed for profiting from the proceeds of those crimes? Gladstone then became intense about another form of slavery, Palmerston's Opium Wars, describing them as infamous and atrocities, that they would bring dread judgment of God on England for our national iniquity towards China, he said. A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. And to this day, that stains our relationship with China. And if, like the Opium Wars, Gladstone had been listened to on Ireland, as we heard, and I say that as the son of an Irish speaker from the famine lands of the west of Ireland, the tragedies of civil war and partition might well have been avoided. Gladstone had seen the consequences of the Irish famine, which led to 1 million deaths and 3 million people emigrating. By contrast, listen to Disraeli when he said, the Irish hate our order, our civilization, our enterprising industry, our pure religion. This wild, reckless, indolent, uncertain, and superstitious race have no sympathy with the English character. Disraeli, yes, the consummate wordsmith, coined what he called the Irish question. Gladstone wrestled with the injustice and sought answers to that question. Of course, great men and women can make us feel uncomfortable. His wife of 60 years, Catherine Glynn, shrewdly remarked, "Oh, William, dear, if you were not such a very great man, what a bore you would be." So I'm not sure he would have been one's drinking friend. But like the rest of us, Gladstone was far from perfect. What made him great rather than a bore were his legendary energy, his formidable intellect, and passionate oratory. One of his detractors said he was Oxford on top and Liverpool below. Ladies and gentlemen, as I come to a conclusion, Roy Jenkins once told me, and I quote, "Gladstone was, without question, the most remarkable specimen of humanity ever to be in number 10 Downing Street. At 76, he climbed the highest peak in the Cairngorms. At 86, he personally wheeled 30,000 of his books up the hill from Harden Castle to the new St. Daniel's Library. His intellectual energy made him a voracious bibliophile, personally annotating the books he read and sitting with his wife as he translated the Odes of Horace or the works of Homer, or reading his Bible in the Greek as he did each day. He was an extraordinary and good man. Undoubtedly, Gladstone and Disraeli were the towering figures of Victorian politics. While the public nicknamed Gladstone the People's William and the GOM, the Grand Old Man, of course, Disraeli preferred to render this acronym as God's only mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you must choose between principle over pragmatism, between the flattering, amusing wordsmith of a truly great statesman and prophetic leader. The only mistake tonight would be to vote for Disraeli above Mr. Gladstone, the greatest of our peacetime prime ministers. Not a mistake I hope that you will make.
Thank you, Lord Alton. Wrapping us up this evening is Dominic Grieve. Dominic is the former member for Beaconsfield. He served as the Attorney General in the coalition government between 2010 and 2014. Dominic, you have the ears of the House.
Mr. President, it's a great pleasure to be able to come here and to speak on behalf of Benjamin Disraeli. And I could do no other, having represented a constituency where even today his memory suffuses the locality, including the office that I used to hold my surgeries in, called Disraeli House, Disraeli Close, and a person much spoken about still with a degree of affection, notwithstanding the fact that his house was situated some 6 miles from Beaconsfield, and I think it's probably right to say that his connection with it was essentially confined to it being the place where he stopped off to have a pee when he travelled from Hughenden to seeing Queen Victoria at Windsor. I think the other association was that when the time came to take a peerage, he took the view that any of the places closer to his home would be treading on the toes of the local landed classes who might wish for those titles for themselves, and of course, and I think importantly, that Edmund Burke was going to be offered the title of Lord Beaconsfield had he lived. And I have to say that his memory survives, and I say this to this House, in a way that Gladstone's does not. Now, many eminent people will speak about Gladstone, but I say to you that Disraeli, particularly in terms of one nation conservatism, is a living presence. I was a one nation conservative. There was a one nation dining club of fellow conservatives who shared that outlook. I have to say, sadly, Mr. President, somewhat reduced these days as a result of Mr. Johnson having decided to disappear off in a rather different direction. And it did pain me this evening, I have to say, to my good friend Lord Adonis, to hear him compare in any way Disraeli to Mr. Johnson. Mr. President, both I think Lord Adonis and I, firstly, I think it's very well known that my views is that I don't have any very much time for the current Prime Minister. But in addition to that, I suspect Lord Adonis and I would be jolly happy if by some magic we could persuade the Prime Minister to walk to a time machine with a one-way ticket back to the 1850s. Because I am absolutely confident that if that were to happen and he were to reappear in the House of Commons of the 1850s or 60s and tell the number of lies at the dispatch box which the current Prime Minister has done without correcting the record subsequently, or for that matter trying to prorogue Parliament in the manner in which the Prime Minister did, I don't think he would have survived more than a few days. That is the extent to which our current politics may have been damaged. But to compare him to Disraeli, who was undoubtedly an adventurer, there's no doubt about that, in a sense, somebody who had got his way into the British political class by his endeavours, is grossly unfair on Disraeli's good facets. And I certainly agree, both men were great men. But you are not in this House this evening being asked to just compare who is the greatest statesman. You are being asked to express a preference about the individual. And moreover, before we start getting too carried away with Gladstonian greatness, and I do accept that he was, in his rather contorted fashion, a very great man, sometimes the pragmatist may do better. Just to take one example, because I probably haven't got time this evening to do more than one, and that was when we heard from Lord Adonis this evening about the Bulgarian atrocities. Now, it's absolutely right that Gladstone went, a man, I might add, who came across half the time as a tight-fisted Chancellor of the Exchequer with a laissez-faire attitude to almost anything, and then suddenly got these bursts of moral energy, whether it was Home Rule or whether it was the Bulgarian atrocities. And in the case of the Bulgarian atrocities, he went on the stump and very successfully raised it as a big moral issue. But he was not in government. The person who brought the Bulgarian atrocities to an end through a negotiated settlement at the Congress of Berlin was Disraeli. He had to wrestle with unimaginable problems to do it. Perhaps not so unimaginable today. He had a foreign secretary, Derby, who was giving cabinet secrets to the Russian ambassador because he disagreed with Disraeli's policy of trying to check the Russians in the Bosphorus. He had a queen who so detested the Russians that she was quite cheerful with the idea of going to war with them. Disraeli avoided both. He succeeded by judicious placing of troops, by negotiation, and finally by enlisting the help of Bismarck and bringing the Austro-Hungarians on side, in crafting at the Congress of Berlin a solution which freed Bulgaria. He was the person who created modern Bulgaria, not from that point of view Gladstone, and actually created it within legitimate borders and not the expanded borders that had previously existed, succeeded in getting the Russians to withdraw, and in fact created a peace settlement which in the Balkan context lasted about 35 years, which quite frankly is pretty extraordinary. He did it. So he shouldn't be lightly dismissed as some lightweight politician. It's true that he shifted his ground when he could see advantage. It was my ancestor, Grosvenor Hodgkinson, who put forward the amendment to the Second Reform Bill, which he cheerfully accepted, which greatly widened the franchise and completely outflanked Gladstone, who was hopping mad about it, really angry because he thought that he had the moral high ground and it suddenly disappeared. Well, that's politics. So do not underestimate Disraeli, and do not underestimate his reforming activities. 2 Factories Acts, an Education Act. It was cautious social reform. His Food and Drugs Act, which was so good, it actually lasted until 1928. He was far less lavish in the granting of honours than Gladstone was. Obviously, they were both in a period where patronage and venality were still on the boundaries of the acceptable. But actually, he stayed rather on the coast of honours. He was much more careful in their distribution. He was also clearly much more fun. Let's face it, even Clement Attlee, when he finally read Morley's biography of Gladstone, he was forced to say of him, this really was a frightful old prig. Fancy writing a letter proposing marriage, including a sentence of 140 words all about the Almighty. But that is exactly what Gladstone did. In contrast, Disraeli, when he returned from his glorious moment in the Parliament of 1868 on the Second Reform Act, he didn't go back to the Carlton Club. He went back to his wife, who served him champagne and a pie, and said to her, "Why, my dear, you are more like a mistress than a wife." He also said, as for enamoured sexagenarians, they avenged the cold hearts of youth. He was a very uxorious man and very happy in his marriage. So, you have a choice this evening. Do you want to go with somebody who may have rather contorted morality and passionate, or do you want to go with somebody who actually got things done? And what would you have made of it if you'd gone to have dinner with them? Bertrand Russell knew what it was like to have dinner with Gladstone. He was the only male present. He was left with him over when the ladies had retired, and Gladstone said nothing to him for 25 minutes until he uttered those memorable words, "I like the port is very good, why has it been given to me in a wine glass?" In contrast, Disraeli invited the 22-year-old Duke of Portland to dinner. He had no idea why he'd been invited, and at the end of the dinner, Disraeli stood up and bowed low to him and said, I know you've just been made a peer. You are very fond of your stepmother, who is the only surviving relative you have. I am going to make her a viscountess, or recommend to the Queen that should be so. And the reason for it is I come from a race that never forgives an injury or forgets a benefit. So there are your 2 personalities. And what I would say to you this evening is vote against the motion and vote for that great man, Benjamin Disraeli, our first non-Gentile Prime Minister, who broke the mould and won the race. Thank you.
Dominic, thank you very much, and thank you to our guest speakers this evening. A couple of notices before we go. As you probably would have heard after hustings, the polls are open and the ballot box is in reception. If you've got your membership card, you can go and vote after this. We, of course, have one more debate next week, and then we're done. But it's been a pleasure this evening. Can we just offer our guest speakers a round of applause?